In the last episode, we implemented a simple add-on that adds tick markers to the default cast bar when you are channeling a spell. This is how it looks in action. Let's cast Drain Soul here on this boar, and as we can see, the tick markers are displayed evenly across the spell, and yeah, they are matching up with the damage, the 11 damage from Drain Soul. However, since we haven't implemented that, if we suffer spell pushback from the board attacking us, the ticks are not updating and they are going to be out of sync with when the spell actually deals damage. And besides that, the only reason why this is working correctly for this particular spell is because Drain Soul does 5 ticks and we hard-coded the number of ticks at 5. So let's fix the add-on to include the real number of ticks for each channeled spell. Like I mentioned, unfortunately the game doesn't actually give you that information, so we have to figure that out for ourselves and essentially provide a database of the number of ticks for each existing spell, which is kind of annoying to be honest. But fortunately, since most add-ons are essentially open source, I am going to use a different add-on that has already done this to base our code off of it. I'm going to use the famous castbar add-on called Quartz, which is definitely open source. All of its code is fully publicly available on GitHub. And as you can see here, from the player.lua file, there is an entire database for the spell ticks for each spell. So I've gone ahead and copied all of that information over to a different file in our add-on folder, which I've called just channelticks.lua, with a few key differences from Quartz. So as you can see, the spellticks database is actually divided into multiple sets of data, one for each expansion, because between expansions certain spells were changed, added, or removed. One of the differences between this version here and the original from Quartz is that Quartz was using the WoW project ID variables, but these are only available on the classic clients, and I would like this add-on to work on every client, whether that is classic or the original older clients. So instead of using those variables, I'm using a different approach. I'm using the getBuildInfo function, which gives you info about the version of the game itself, but also the TOC version. I then convert that TOC version to a number, because here it's returned as a string, so I convert it to a number, and I do basically a very similar check to what Quartz does, but instead of simply checking for variable equality, since these variables don't exist in the older clients, I actually do a version check for the TOC number. So every version that is between 10,000 and 20,000 means it's WoW patch 1 dot something something. So that's vanilla. Anything above 20,000, it's 2 dot something something, which is Burning Crusade. And 30,000 is version 3, Wrath of the Lich King, etc, etc. And then the channel ticks database itself is, well, a table, because basically every quote-unquote object in Lua is a table. And you may notice that the syntax here is a little bit weird, because we are using the AND operator in order to assign stuff to a table, and ANDs and ORs. So when you're using these keywords outside of a logical Boolean operation, they actually work almost like the ternary operator. So if you're familiar with, for example, C# or another language, it would be the equivalent of doing, if the game is WoW vanilla, so if this is true, then you do all of this stuff, right? So you do WoW vanilla ticks. Otherwise, you check if it's WoW Burning Crusade, then you do WoW Burning Crusade ticks. Otherwise, and so on and so forth. So to summarize, if the game version is WoW vanilla, then these are the spell ticks. Otherwise, if it's Burning Crusade, these are the spell ticks. If it's Wrath of the Lich King, it's these ones, etc, etc. Another small difference is that I've replaced the usage of the getSpellName function here, because it didn't exist in the client I was using, and instead I'm using the getSpellInfo, which coincidentally also returns the name of the spell as the first return variable. The first argument that you pass to this function, and the getSpellName function as well, is the spell ID of the spell, but then this gets converted into the name, because it's the first return argument. So we're using the first return argument as the key in the table, and then the number of ticks as the value of that table. And we do that for every spell, except spells where specific ranks of those spells actually have different tick amounts. So every rank of arcane missiles, except the first two, have 5 ticks, but the first two have 3 and 4. And this means that when we use this table in the code, we actually need to check specific ranks first, and then we can check the generic spell name. So it's important to keep in mind that accessing this table can be different depending on the situation. And now the last thing that I did is a workaround for the fact that older clients don't really have an easy time retrieving spell IDs. So the fact that certain ranks of specific spells are indexed via their spell ID is not very easy for older clients to manage. So I run a function here that searches the channel ticks table for every spell that is stored with an ID, and instead replaces it with the spell name plus the rank of the spell. So I use the pairs function, which basically iterates over everything in a table, giving you the key and the value for each entry. I know that the keys can be spell IDs, so I use the toNumber function to try and convert it to a number. If it did convert to a number successfully, then I use that spell ID to get the name and the rank of the spell, and I add a new entry to the table with the spell name concatenated with the rank. So this is how you do string concatenation in Lua. If you were to do the same thing in C#, you would use the plus sign instead, but in Lua you use 2 dots. So the last thing I want to mention in this file is this line at the top. So starting, I believe it was in the original Burning Crusade client, Blizzard started providing you with a local environment to store the variables for your add-on, and to facilitate that, they provide you with an add-on name and add-on variable that is provided to every single one of your Lua files. So if you declare a line exactly like this at the top of any of your Lua files, you're going to get a variable which contains the name of your add-on, and another variable which contains a table that stores all of the global variables for your add-on. So if you want to add something to this table, you can, and this is a good opportunity also to explain that every single table in Lua is mutable, which means you can add anything to basically any object. So you can grab this table, access the channel ticks variable, and if that variable doesn't exist, it will actually be added to this table. And accessing a variable like this, by the way, is exactly the same thing as accessing it like this. This is basically just syntactic sugar for indexing into the table with the channel ticks key, and then either getting or assigning any value you want to it. Okay, so with that out of the way, we can go back to our tick markers file. Let's add the same line at the top of the file so that we can access the channel ticks table that we've created, and we will modify the getChannelInfo function to also provide us with the number of ticks. So the way that we're going to do this is, if we're using the modern clients, the number of ticks is going to be, actually before we do that, let's store the channel ticks table as a local variable here, and we get it from addon.channelticks. So the way that we will retrieve the number of ticks in the modern clients is we'll check the channel ticks table for the specific spell ID, and if that entry exists, that means it's one of those special cases where different ranks have a different amount of ticks. Otherwise, we will index into the same table with the spell name instead, and we will return that. It should actually be plural ticks. On the other hand, if we are using the old clients, we don't actually have access to the spell ID from this function, so instead we will use the rank, and we will try to index into the table using the name of the spell and the rank, and if that entry exists, then it's one of the special cases. Otherwise, we index it with just the spell name. And we shall also return the number of ticks here. Now when we call getChannelInfo, now we have an additional return value. So we want to store the number of ticks as well. We can delete the hard-coded version. And for safety, let's actually check if the ticks variable doesn't exist. Then we simply return out of this function, because we can't actually do anything if we don't know the number of ticks. So the situations where that is going to happen is if the player is actually not channeling anything, then it's simply going to return early, and returning early is basically the same thing as returning nil. Or if for some reason the spell we're channeling does not exist in the table, then this variable will be nil, and it's also going to trigger this early return. Okay, so this should fix the hard-coded ticks amount, so now this should work for every spell, but we're still not updating the ticks when we get spell pushback. In order to do that, we need to save some variables, which are then going to be updated in the channel update function. So we need somewhere to save those values. So first, let's pass an additional variable into the channel start function and into the channel update function as well, because we'll need it later. And this is going to be the same object that is received in the onEvent function. So we're just going to use that, pass it into channel start and channel update. And this object is actually our frame F, because that is the object that registered itself with the onEvent script. As we mentioned before, every single object in Lua that isn't of a simple type, like a number or a boolean, is a table, which means we can add additional values to it. So in this case, we are going to add a channel start that's going to cache the start time of the channel spell, and a channel end, which is going to cache the end time. We also want to cache the time of each individual marker as the local tick time value we calculated earlier. And now for the channel update, let us actually copy most of the start function, so we don't need to cache the start and end times again. We only want to do that the first time the channel happens. We still want to calculate the duration, but we don't actually need to recalculate the tick interval, and we definitely need the tick time, but we actually calculated it already in the start function. We just need to update it slightly here. So at the start of the function, we need to figure out the delta between how long our channel was initially versus how long it is now that we've received pushback. So we start with the end time that we saved originally, and we subtract the new end time that we got from the getChannelInfo function. Now here you may be thinking, well, if the channel got updated to end earlier, because that's what happens when you get pushback, you get less time channeling the spell, but the spell also does less damage or less healing or whatever it is that it does. You would think that the updated information would keep the same start time, right? Because, well, the channel already started however many seconds ago. That didn't change. What did change was the end time. You would be wrong. Yes, that would make a lot of sense if that was what happened, but for some reason, Blizzard doesn't really make a lot of sense in this particular function. So when the channel updates, not only do you get a new end time, which is earlier than the original, you also get a different start time in such a way that the duration stays the same as it was originally. Now, in my opinion, that makes no sense, because it's impossible to change the time of something that has already happened, but whatever, we have to deal with that. So instead we need to use the end time that we calculated and the new end time that has been provided as a response to the update event. Now, for good measure, and this isn't strictly necessary, but I think it makes the add-on be even nicer, is we can calculate the point in the spell at which we are currently and only update ticks that still haven't happened. So if a tick has already happened, we should leave the tick marker exactly where it was. So to do that, we use the getTime function. We have to multiply it by 1000 because start and end times for spell-related functions are in milliseconds, but getTime function actually returns seconds. So in order to make them match, we multiply this one by 1000, and then we subtract the original start time of the spell, which makes the now variable the time relative to the start of the spell. So if 3 seconds have passed since we started casting the spell, now we'll have the number 3000. And then we once again update the end time to the new end time, so that if another instance of spell pushback happens, we can calculate the delta again based on this new end time. And down here in the for loop, we want to update the tick time for each marker that hasn't yet happened. So we will check if the tick time for the particular marker that we're iterating is larger than the current time. In that case, we make the tick time increase by the delta. So this is how much time we lost from the pushback. It takes the original end value, which is larger, and subtracts the new end value, which is smaller. And then we also want to update the saved value on that marker. If the time at which the tick is supposed to happen is larger than the total duration of the spell, that means we actually lost that tick, so we can just hide the marker. Otherwise, we use the exact same formula that we had in the start function to update the tick marker to the correct position with the new update time. Let's again go back into the game. Let's reload our user interface, and we'll cast Drain Soul again, which unfortunately is causing some Lua errors. Oh, of course, okay, I know what's happening. Let's go back. Let's go back into the code and fix it. We never added the channel ticks Lua file to our TOC file. So we want this file to actually be loaded before our tick markers file, since this one declares a new variable, a new table, that tick markers immediately uses and caches in a local variable. So if we didn't have this line here, and instead we always accessed channel ticks only inside the function, then we wouldn't need to do that. This works fine as well. But I like to cache the variable locally to the whole file, and that means this one needs to run first in order to populate it, so that this one can then use it. So updating the TOC file makes it so that we have to fully restart the game. You can't simply go into the game and reload UI, because the new files won't be picked up. So after fully restarting the game, let's try once again to cast Drain Soul. And okay, the ticks are in their correct spot, as long as we don't have pushback at least. So let's kill this boar and try to trigger this with some spell pushback and see if it's working. Yep, so the ticks have updated. The numbers are still appearing. We can see that they're still correctly synced with when the damage actually happens. Yeah, and even Drain Life works. That's awesome. So this has been a quick tutorial on how to create a WoW add-on. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope you like and subscribe, and stay tuned for next videos on RPG items, and thank you very much for watching. See you guys in the next one. Peace!